Welcome back to the show, everybody. This week we're going to continue working on part 3 of my monster Honda three-wheeler conversion bike. Now last week we started the swing arm and jackshaft fabrication, and this week we're going to finish up those two pieces and work on the rear suspension as well. Now since we couldn't find jackshaft sprockets that would fit both the Honda chain as well as the 3/4 inch keyed jackshaft, the solution was to use a 3/4 inch weld-on hub and chop up a 428 sprocket. After I cut a hole in the sprocket with the plasma cutter, I bolted the sprocket and hub together so I could center everything up for welding. There, the sprocket slid right on the jackshaft and there was no run out to speak of. Now let's put the flange bearings on the jackshaft and get the swing arm squared up and centered for welding. I used a couple of carpenter squares just vice gripped together to center the swing arm onto the frame. Now that's some quality stuff right there. I also welded together a little tool that will connect the jackshaft to the rear axle, so the rear axle is going to be perfectly squared up before I start welding it in place. There. One homemade swing arm. Now let's move on to building the outer sprocket for the jackshaft. The outer jackshaft sprocket had to be built from scratch, just like we built the inner one earlier. Now, just in case you're wondering about the gearing on the bike, the inner jackshaft sprocket that connects to the engine is 17 tooth, and the outer jackshaft sprocket that connects to the rear sprocket is 13 tooth, and the rear sprocket is 54 tooth. That's good to get the bike up to about 35 miles an hour maxed out. Now let's move on to building the rear shock mounts. The first thing I gotta do is chop up a couple of pieces of scrap metal for the lower mounts and get them welded up to the swing arm. Then I'm going to weld on a couple pieces of chopped up angle iron to the back of the swing arm so I can use some chain tug tensioners on the axle. There, that should work just like a real bike. Now let's move on to drilling some holes in the shock mounts and welding some studs. Nice. Now let's move on to building the top mounts on the frame. Since the tires are so darn wide on the bike, I had to figure out a way to extend the upper shock mounts out quite a ways from the side of the frame. So I chopped up a 3/4 inch steel rod, and the plans are to U-bolt it to the back of the bike. I'll start by drilling a couple pilot holes just to make sure everything is centered up, and then I'll move on to a bigger bit. There, just like that. Now we can center everything up and tighten the U-bolts down, and then we'll drill some holes in the end of the rods where we'll weld in some studs for the shock mounts. I'm going to start out by drilling a little pilot hole and hope to heck I don't break the little bit off and ruin my day. Now I'm going to drill a hole all the way through the side of the rod, and the plan is to insert a threaded stud in the end of the rod and then use those two little holes to plug weld it in place. There. Now we can tighten our U-bolts down again and bolt the tops of the shocks on, and we should have some rear suspension. Cool, we got our jackshaft done and the rear suspension is done. Now I think it's time to move on to building the rear hub and sprocket. Wicked. For the rear hub, I used a front drum brake hub off of an ATC125M Three Wheeler. Now what should work pretty good as a rear hub too. I just need to build a rear sprocket flange out of this pipe and some scrap metal. I'm tracing out the bolt pattern for the flange on this piece of scrap, whatever this thing is, and then I'm going to move on to drilling out the lug holes and chop out what I need with the plasma cutter. figure I'll cut the middle of the flange out with the hole saw since I'm not the best with the plasma cutter and I want things to look really pretty. I'm using a few magnetic squares to square up the flange for welding. Now the last time I tried this, it didn't square up perfectly, but it's nothing a little hammering or shims on the sprocket can't fix if I got a little bit of run out. No problem. There, now we can slide the sprocket on the hub and we'll weld it in place in next week's video. But in the meantime, you can click the video on the left if you missed the last video in this series, or you can click the video on the right if you want to check out another one of my cool builds. Thanks again, and I'll see you next week.